Funny thing about being invisible, you rarely notice it until it starts to feel like freedom. My name is Ethan Cole, and for 31 years I was a quiet one, the steady one, the one they could always count on, but never cared enough to really see. It started on a Thursday. Late summer heat still clinging to the air, the sky heavy with the kind of gray that makes you feel tired just looking at it. I remember the exact moment. I had just finished washing my only decent mug when my sister, Zoe, knocked on my door. Midnight mascara smudge, carrying 3 overstuffed bags and a story I'd heard 100 times before. "Ethan, please," she whispered, voice raw and shaky. "Liam cheated again. I can't go back tonight." I opened the door. Of course I did. That's what I'd always done. The responsible brother. The predictable one. The one who made space for other people's chaos. By morning, she'd spread her clothes across my bedroom floor. By the end of the second day, my living room had turned into her private lounge. And still, I told myself it would be temporary. That was the word she used. Just until I figured things out. But Zoe's temporary had always been my permanent. I work in data security. Nothing glamorous, but it pays well enough for a small 2-bedroom apartment, and it gives me a kind of quiet I've spent years building. But the thing about quiet, it's fragile. Zoe shattered it within a week. She invited friends over. At first, they were polite, apologetic glances as they brushed past me in the hallway. Then it turned into late-night parties, music pounding through my walls, glasses left on counters, makeup smears on my towels. I remember coming home one evening, exhausted from a 14-hour day. I opened the door and found strangers dancing where my coffee table used to be. Someone had shoved it aside to make space. My apartment, my carefully built sanctuary, felt foreign. The worst part wasn't even the mess. It was the way she looked at me when I asked her to tone it down. A tilt of her head, an amused little smirk, like I was an inconvenience in my own home. "God, Ethan, you're so dramatic," she said, without even pausing the music on her phone. "You act like this is all yours." That stung in a way I can't explain. Because yes, it was mine. Every chipped mug, every secondhand bookshelf, every lamp bought on sale, paid for by night spent debugging code, and weekends I'd rather have been anywhere else. But in that moment, none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. 2 weeks in, I was sleeping on the couch. 3 weeks in, I started noticing things missing. My leather jacket, my old vinyl collection, the vintage watch I inherited from Grandpa. I confronted her once, cautiously, because Zoe could turn any accusation into an attack on me. "Zoe," I said quietly, "have you seen my watch?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "Nope," she said, and the word landed like a door slamming shut. I still tried to be patient. That's the thing about being the quiet one. Patience becomes part of your identity, even when it starts costing you everything. Then came the day I logged into the most important client call of my career. 6 months of prep, countless late nights, all building up to that one pitch. She promised she'd keep the noise down. I believed her. And as I started my presentation, I heard it. Bass pounding through the walls, laughter, someone shouting from the kitchen. My camera froze on my own face, eyes closed, jaw clenched. When the call ended, so did my contract. $18,000 gone. Zoe looked up from her group of friends and actually laughed. "Ethan, it's just money," she said. "You're overreacting." And that, more than the noise, more than the missing things, was what broke something in me. I called Mom. I thought maybe, finally, she'd see my side. But all I got was her soft, practiced sigh. "Ethan, she's going through so much right now. You've always been a mature one. Can't you just support her a little longer?" I didn't even feel anger anymore. Just a cold, hollow realization. They wouldn't choose me. They never had. So that night, I packed a single bag. Laptop, charger, wallet, 2 shirts, and a toothbrush. I walked out without a word. And the next morning, no one called. I didn't go far. An old college friend, Ben, let me crash on his couch. "No questions," he said, and kept his word. 6 weeks passed. Silence from my family. Not a text, not a voicemail, not even a missed call. But for the first time, that silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like proof. Proof that I'd been right all along. In my family, Zoe's chaos mattered more than my existence. That was the night I decided to stop being the silent brother everyone ignored and start being the silent storm they never saw coming. And that right there is where everything changed. I didn't leave that night in anger. Anger burns too fast, too bright. It blinds you, makes you sloppy. No, I left in something colder, sharper. A quiet clarity that only comes when you finally stop begging to be seen. For 6 weeks, I became a ghost. The funny part? Nobody noticed. Zoe stayed in my apartment like she'd always belonged there. My parents kept living as though nothing had changed, still sending her little stay strong messages, still pretending I was a steady background character to the family story. Reliable, predictable, disposable. And that's when I realized invisibility isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's the best disguise you could ever ask for. The first days on Ben's couch were strange. The kind of strange that makes you question who you really are when no one's watching. He had a tiny apartment above a bakery, the air always smelling like warm bread and burnt coffee. I'd wake up on the squeaky couch, sunlight hitting my face, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a single demand waiting for me. No noise, no expectations, no Zoe. At first, I thought the silence would crush me, but slowly, it started to feel like freedom. One morning, maybe 10 days in, I sat with my laptop at Ben's kitchen table. The steam from my coffee curled in the air, the city buzzing faintly outside. I opened a blank document, just to see what would happen. I typed, "They don't notice you until you do something they can't ignore." And that single sentence became my plan. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to show them who I really was. Quietly. Precisely. Completely. Step 1. Proof. On a Sunday afternoon, when I knew Zoe would be out, brunch photos for her curated Instagram life, I used my spare key. Walking into my own apartment felt like stepping onto a stage I didn't belong to anymore. Clothes I didn't recognize draped over my furniture. My books shoved aside to make room for her makeup and ring lights. Empty wine bottles scattered across the kitchen counter. I moved carefully, methodically. Behind the bookshelf, I placed a small motion-activated camera, hidden in the shadows. Another one under the TV stand, pointed toward the living room. It wasn't about revenge. It was about evidence. Step 2. Wait. For 3 weeks, I lived out of Ben's living room, working my contract jobs during the day and reviewing footage at night. At first, it was almost boring. Zoe lounging on my couch, scrolling on her phone, rolling her eyes at her own reflection. Then it escalated. Parties. People I'd never seen wearing my clothes, drinking from my mugs. One guy slept in my bed. Another spilled beer on my rug and Zoe laughed, kicking him playfully instead of telling him to clean it up. The worst was seeing my things vanish in real time. My guitar, a birthday gift from my grandmother, gone. My limited edition headphones, sold. My framed degree from college, shoved aside and stepped on by strangers. Watching it felt like a slow funeral for everything I'd built. But I kept going, because this time my silence had a purpose. Step 3. Act. With timestamped screenshots and video clips, I compiled a file. A quiet kind of power grew inside me as the folder filled up. Then I walked into the landlord's office. Mr. Harris, a man with gray hair and tired eyes, looked up, surprised to see me. "Ethan, haven't seen you in weeks." I handed him the flash drive. "My apartment's been occupied without my consent," I said, voice steady, heart steady. "Everything you need is on here." He nodded slowly. "This is the lot." "Yes," I said, "and it's real." A week later, Zoe was serving eviction notice. She called me within minutes. At least 10 missed calls. Then texts, her words jumping from fake concern to fury. "What the hell, Ethan? You can't do this. I'm your sister. I needed help. You ruined my life, you petty bastard." I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. Then Mom called. Her voicemail was exactly what I'd expected. "Ethan, why couldn't you handle this quietly?" She's your sister. We raised you to be better than this. Better than what? Better than defending my own life? I blocked them all that night. My phone felt lighter in my hand afterward, like shaking off a weight I'd carried for too long. In the stillness that followed, I realized something. I'd spent my whole life trying not to upset anyone, walking on eggshells so they'd keep loving me. But love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's dependence. Step 4. Face them. I knew it would come. The family dinner. The carefully arranged meeting where they'd corner me, try to guilt me back into being useful. And sure enough, Mom texted Ben. Tell Ethan there's a family dinner Sunday. We need to talk. I almost didn't go, but something inside me knew. This was a moment, not to scream, not to fight, but to speak my truth so quietly, it would echo louder than anything they'd ever heard from me. I walked into the dining room late, on purpose. The roast was already going cold. My father carving slices like a performance. Zoe in her usual place, feigning innocence. Mom tried to smile. Ethan, sit. We were just saying. But I stayed standing, hands in my pockets, calm. And in that moment, I saw them truly. Not as the people I'd always hoped they'd be, but as they really were. Small, afraid, desperate to keep the story going where I'm the background, and Zoe is the star. Not anymore. I let the silence stretch until it became heavy, uncomfortable. Then finally I said, funny thing, I haven't even been living there for weeks. Their faces changed. Confusion first, then panic, then denial. And I knew this was only the beginning. Funny thing, I haven't even been living there for weeks. The words settled on the table like a broken glass. For a moment, no one moved. The room itself seemed to tighten around us, trapping their shallow breaths and forced smiles. My mother blinked twice, as if trying to reset what she'd just heard. My father's fork hovered in the air, roast chicken dripping onto the tablecloth. Zoe's perfectly rehearsed smirk slipped just for a heartbeat, but enough for me to see it. Fear. They hadn't expected me to speak. They'd invited me here to fold me back into my old role. The quiet brother, the understanding son, the safe bet. But I wasn't that person anymore. My mother was the first to recover. Her voice trembled at the edges, a soft sweetness sharpened by control. Ethan, what do you mean? Of course you've been living there. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. No, I said, I left 6 weeks ago. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Where have you been staying? That question should have hurt. It should have reminded me of every birthday they forgot, every achievement they brushed aside. But it didn't. It just confirmed what I'd always known. They never really saw me, only the space I filled for their convenience. I let the silence stretch. Across the table, Zoe swallowed hard, her eyes darting from me to Dad, then back again. Finally, Dad spoke, voice tight. You're being ridiculous. You can't just vanish. What about your responsibilities? Your apartment? I tilted my head, almost curious. My apartment? The one Zoe turned into her personal playground? The one where strangers slept in my bed, where my things were sold off for cash? The words came out calm, almost quiet. No shouting, no shaking hands. Just facts, laid bare under the flickering dining room light. Zoe's face flushed crimson. Ethan, But I raised a hand, not to silence her, but to mark the boundary she'd never respected. I'm not interested in your excuses, I said. Not anymore. My uncle, who had stayed silent until now, shifted in his chair. Wait, you weren't living there? But your name's on the lease. I nodded slowly. Exactly. And that's why she got evicted. Because everything she did in my name. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope, thick with printed screenshots, photos, timestamps, my months of quiet work. I placed it on the table. Mom stared at it, almost afraid to touch it. What is this? Proof, I said, of everything Zoe did while you were all too busy defending her to notice I was gone. Zoe's voice cracked. You spied on me? I met her eyes, colder than she'd ever seen them. No, I said, I protected what I built. something none of you cared to do for me. The silence that followed was deeper than any argument could ever be. It wasn't a silence of shock. It was a silence of realization, slow, creeping, inescapable. They had built a family story where I was invisible. And now, for the first time, they were forced to see me. Mom tried again, her voice breaking. "Ethan, we didn't know. If you just told us." "I did," I said, in my own way. Every quiet no, every small boundary you ignored. But you never listened unless I sacrificed myself for Zoe. Dad's face hardened. "She's your sister. Family comes first." I almost laughed, but it came out as a single, dry breath. "Family? You only remember that word when you need me to fix her mess." Across the table, Zoe's eyes glistened. "You don't understand what I've been through, Ethan. You have no idea how hard it's been." "I do," I interrupted, "because I cleaned up after you every time, paid the bills, covered your lies, lost a contract worth months of rent because of your noise, and you didn't even look up from your phone." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because, for the first time, she realized I wasn't going to listen. My mother's shoulders sagged. "So what now? You want to punish us? Is that it?" I shook my head slowly. "No, I don't want revenge. I want distance. I want peace. The same peace I've tried to build my entire life." They looked at me like I'd spoken another language. Because for them, family had always meant noise, chaos, and apologies demanded, never given. But not for me. Not anymore. I stepped back on the table, the chair still empty where they'd saved me a seat I never planned to take. "This dinner," I said, voice steady, "wasn't about me. It was about fixing Zoe's mess again. But this time you can't." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please don't do this." But I'd already done it. 6 weeks ago, when I chose myself. I turned to leave. My father's voice stopped me, hoarse and shaking. "Where are you going?" I paused at the doorway, hand on the frame. "To somewhere I'm not just a quiet one," I said. "Somewhere I'm seen, even if it's only by me." And then I walked out, not in anger, not in triumph, but in peace. The air outside felt colder than I remembered. Or maybe it wasn't the air. Maybe it was me. When the door closed behind me, it felt final, like the click of a lock you know you'll never open again. I stood there on the porch for a moment, breathing in the night. The sky above was an indifferent stretch of dark blue, scattered with stars that had watched generations come and go without caring who stayed or who left. Funny, I thought, how something so vast could make you feel both small and free at the same time. I walked slowly down the path to the street, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. No one followed. No voice called my name from behind. Part of me had always hoped for that. A final wait. A hand on my shoulder. Something to prove that I'd ever truly belonged at that table. But hope, I realized, had been the most dangerous lie of all. Back at Ben's place, I sat in the kitchen under the tired yellow light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each second of my new life. I opened my laptop, the same one I'd used to build my career, to write quiet code while Zoe's chaos roared in the background. Now, there was only the hum of the fridge and the faint traffic outside. I should have felt relief. Instead, what I felt was emptier, deeper, a grief not for what I'd lost, but for what had never really been there to lose. Growing up, I'd always thought family was something solid. Sunday dinners, shared jokes, unspoken loyalty. Instead, I'd gotten silence that felt like a question I could never answer. Zoe had always been the center, the storm everyone revolved around. And me? I was a steady satellite, unseen, unpraised, but necessary to keep the system from collapsing. Until the day I stepped out of orbit and watched them all keep spinning, barely noticing the gap I'd left behind. I remembered a night years ago when I was 16. I'd stayed up late working on a school project, the glow of my old laptop the only light in my room. Zoe had come home drunk, crying so loud it woke the whole house. Mom rushed to her side. Dad, too. I waited at the top of the stairs, invisible, listening. I'd won a math competition that day. No one had asked how it went. Even then, I think a small part of me knew love in our house was noisy, dramatic, demanding, and I was none of those things. In the quiet of Ben's kitchen, I realized something else. It wasn't just about Zoe or my parents. It was about me. I had spent years making myself smaller, softer, easier to ignore, just so I wouldn't threaten the fragile balance they needed. I let them write my part as the silent brother, the reliable son, the one who cleans up but never complains. And the truth? I was complicit in my own erasure. Ben came home late that night, keys jingling as he kicked off his shoes. He paused when he saw me sitting there, still staring at the open laptop, the document blank except for a blinking cursor. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded but didn't speak. How do you explain to someone that you're mourning a version of yourself that never fully existed? He sat across from me, cracking open a beer. "Long night. Long decade," I said, and surprised even myself by laughing quietly. Ben didn't push. He never did. Instead, he took a sip, looked around his cluttered kitchen, and said, "You know, man, maybe it's not about what you lost. Maybe it's about what you get to build now." Simple words, but they settled into something inside me like seeds. I closed the laptop, exhaled slowly. He was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying someone else's mess. All I had was me, and maybe that was enough. That night, lying awake on his lumpy couch, I thought about what enough really meant. Not applause, not approval, not even forgiveness. Just peace. A place where I could drink coffee without stepping over someone else's chaos. Where my silence wasn't mistaken for weakness, but chosen as strength. It was a strange thought, and strangely comforting. In the morning, I packed my few things into my backpack. Ben raised an eyebrow. "You leaving?" "Not far," I said. "Just moving forward." He nodded. "Good." I signed a lease that afternoon. A small studio apartment across town. Nothing fancy. Exposed brick, uneven floorboards, a window that overlooked a fire escape instead of a skyline. But it was mine. No noise I didn't invite in. No footsteps I didn't recognize. No Zoe. I set my single suitcase by the door, ran a hand over the dusty windowsill, and exhaled. This was what beginning over looked like. Messy, quiet, imperfect, but real. I spent that first night sitting on the bare floor, eating cheap takeout from a plastic container, my laptop balanced on my knees. Outside, the city hummed with stranger stories. Inside, for the first time, there was only my story. I typed 3 words into a blank document. "I am here." And for the first time in a long time, it felt true. I didn't sleep much that first night in the new apartment. The radiator clanged like an old heartbeat. Pipes hissed behind the walls. But the noise wasn't what kept me awake. It was a quiet that followed. A kind of quiet that felt almost unfamiliar. Not the quiet of being ignored, but the quiet of finally, truly being alone. And for a while, I didn't know if that was freedom or loneliness. I sat by the window as the city moved outside. People rushing to catch last trains, laughter spilling from bars, sirens cutting the night. All these lives, each carrying its own story. For the first time, mine wasn't tangled up in someone else's chaos. And it terrified me, because if I couldn't blame Zoe or my parents anymore, who was left to answer for my choices? Just me. The morning sun hit the cracked paint on the windowsill. I made coffee in a chip mug I'd picked up from a thrift shop around the corner. The steam rose, curling around my thoughts. I looked around. Bare walls, a borrowed mattress on the floor, boxes half unpacked. It didn't look like much, but it felt honest. Every dent, every scuff mark. It was all mine. I opened my laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. For years, I'd written code that fixed other people's problems. Clean, efficient solutions for messes I didn't create. But what did it mean to build something for myself? Not just a product, a life. The thought scared me more than I wanted to admit. But it also sparked something small and stubborn in my chest. By noon, I'd started a list. Not what I'd lost, but of what I wanted to find. A job that valued what I built, not just my silence. A home that stayed peaceful, even on my worst days. People who showed up without asking me to shrink. And most of all, a version of myself I could look in the mirror and respect. That afternoon, I walked through my new neighborhood. Narrow streets lined with little shops. A record store that smelled of dust and nostalgia. A coffee shop where the barista had a tattoo of a paper crane on her wrist. It wasn't much like the polished part of the city where I'd lived before. But I liked it more for that. It felt real. Lived in. A little bruised like me. I bought a cheap bookshelf from a second-hand store. Carried it home on the bus. The paint was chipped, one leg shorter than the others. But when I set it against the wall, it stood. There was something strangely comforting about that. Flawed, but standing. Just like me. That evening, Ben texted, "How's the new place?" I sent him a photo of the bookshelf. Crooked, but mine. He replied with a single word. Perfect. And somehow it felt like it was. Days blurred into a quiet routine. Early mornings with coffee and blank documents. Long afternoons chasing freelance projects. Nights walking under streetlights, letting the city's hum fill the spaces Zoe's voice used to occupy my head. Slowly, my apartment started to feel less like a hiding place and more like home. A mug on the windowsill. A jacket on the chair. My laptop open on the floor. Little by little, it stopped feeling temporary. But the past doesn't just leave because you move your things. Sometimes it shows up in memories you can't control. Like the time Zoe broke my favorite mug and laughed, telling me I was too attached to stupid things. Or when Dad said, "She's your sister, you know she needs more help than you." Or Mom sighed whenever I spoke up, "Ethan, don't start." I carried those moments like invisible scars. Now, alone in the small room, I could finally look at them, and I realized they hurt, but they didn't define me anymore. One night, unable to sleep, I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Proof. Screenshots, videos, timelines. The work of weeks spent in silence, collecting evidence. Part of me wanted to delete it. Proof of betrayal wasn't something I wanted to keep. But another part of me knew it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembering what silence can do when it's chosen, not forced. I closed the folder without deleting it, then opened a new document and wrote, "They taught me silence was weakness, but silence can also be strength if it's yours." Reading those words, I felt something shift, a quiet acceptance. I didn't need them to change to find peace. I just needed to stop waiting for them to. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. I listened to it for a while, letting it wash over the noise in my head. For so long, I tried to belong to people who only saw me when they needed me. Now, belonging didn't feel so important. Being true did. At midnight, I stood by the window, looking out at the empty street. The city didn't care where I came from, didn't ask why I'd left. And maybe that was the best part. For the first time, my story wasn't being written by someone else's crisis. It was just mine. The days started to build a rhythm, not the frantic, defensive rhythm of cleaning up Zoe's disasters or tiptoeing around my parents' expectations, but something slower, quieter, mine. In the mornings, I'd wait before sunrise. The city outside still half asleep, windows dark except for the occasional glow of an early commuter. I'd drink coffee by the window, steam curling around my thoughts, and watch the day begin. Funny how something as simple as an unshared morning could feel like freedom. I picked up small freelance coding jobs. Nothing glamorous. Fixing bugs for a local business website, designing a database for an indie bookstore, updating an old online store's checkout process. But each project was a quiet victory. A reminder that what I built mattered, even if no one clapped. The payments were modest, enough to cover rent and groceries, with a little left to save. But more important than the money was the proof. I wasn't just Zoe's brother, or my parents' afterthought. I was Ethan Ward, and I could stand on my own. Some evenings, I'd walk to the tiny coffee shop on the corner. The same barista with the paper crane tattoo was always there, humming quietly as she worked. She learned my name by the third visit. "Ethan, right?" she'd ask, sliding a mug across the counter. The first time, I hesitated before nodding. Not because I didn't remember my own name, but because I wasn't used to being seen without being compared to someone else. At night, the apartment felt bigger than it was. The mattress on the floor, the thrifted bookshelf, now holding a handful of secondhand paperbacks. A single framed photo, not a family, but the skyline I'd taken on my phone the day I moved in. Sometimes the quiet was comforting. Other times, it felt like an echo chamber, my thoughts bouncing back at me louder than I'd like. But I'd take honest loneliness over performative love any day. One Thursday, I got an email from a mid-sized startup looking for a back-end developer. The job wasn't huge, but it was steady. Remote work, decent pay, a small team. They'd found my profile through a forum where I'd helped someone debug a complicated script. No resume, no references, just the work itself. That felt good. Better than good. It felt fair. The interview was short. They asked about my approach to problem solving, what I'd built, and what I wanted. For once, I didn't undersell myself. I want to build systems that make people's lives easier, I said. Clean, reliable code. Tools that stay out of the way so people can focus on what matters. No buzzwords. No pretending to be something bigger or flashier. Just me. 2 days later, the offer came through. $85,000 a year to start. Fully remote. Flexible hours. I accepted before doubt could creep in. When the confirmation email arrived, I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I whispered aloud just to hear it. I did this. No Zoe. No dad calling in a favor. No quiet compromise to keep peace. Just work I'd done. Choices I'd made. It shouldn't have felt revolutionary. But it did. I texted Ben the news. He called back almost immediately. Dude, congrats. See? I told you. His voice was so casual, so sure that it almost made me laugh. Like he'd never doubted it would happen, even when I had. Thanks, man, I said. Really? You're buying the first round next time, he teased. And for once, I didn't shrink from the attention. Deal. Later that night, I opened the old folder on my laptop again. Proof. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at it. Just distance. What had happened still mattered. It shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore. I backed it up to a cloud drive, just in case. Then moved the folder to an external hard drive, out of sight. I thought about calling my parents, to tell them about the job, to share something that mattered to me. But the thought stopped there, because I knew exactly what would happen. Zoe would still be the topic within 5 minutes. Dad would find a way to remind me to look out for her. Mom would sigh if I hinted at how hard it had been, and the joy I felt now would shrink back into something defensive. So I didn't call. Instead, I told myself what I needed to hear. I'm proud of you. It felt strange, like speaking a new language, but it felt right. On Saturday, I bought a small plant for the apartment, a pothose vine, resilient, forgiving, hard to kill even when neglected. I set it on the windowsill, where it could catch the morning sun. It wasn't much, but it was life, growing, quietly, without needing permission. I realized then, peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the small spaces we protect fiercely, even when no one understands why. And that was worth everything. The first Monday morning of my new job felt oddly ceremonial, like I was stepping onto a stage, except this time there was no family in the audience waiting to decide whether I'd done it right. I showered, shaved, put on a clean shirt, though the team would only ever see me from the shoulders up on a webcam. It wasn't about them. It was about me, telling myself, you're not the shadow in someone else's story anymore. This is yours. My new manager, Liam, introduced himself over video chat. He had the calm energy of someone who didn't feel the need to dominate every room. Take your time ramping up, he said. We care about clean work, not rush work. Those words felt like water on dry soil. For so long, I'd worked under the silent rule of my family's crises. Fix it now, don't question, don't pause. Here, for the first time, I was allowed to breathe. The work itself felt familiar. Writing back-end logic, structuring databases, catching bugs before they could turn into fires. But the feeling was new, building for people who trusted me, not because they had no choice, but because they respected what I could do. Every task I completed added an invisible brick to something solid, a life I could finally recognize as my own. Yet even in this fresh start, old habits lurked. On my second week, Zoe texted me. Just 4 words. "Can we talk, please?" My chest tightened before I'd even finished reading. Funny how a single line could drag years of history back into the present. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, but because I knew where that conversation would end, with me holding pieces of her life while mine slipped through my fingers again. I powered off my phone and went back to work. That night, guilt whispered to me, wasn't she still my sister? Was silence just a new way of running away? But deeper than guilt was something steadier, resolve. I hadn't walked away to punish her. I'd walked away to protect a part of me that had spent too long cleaning up after someone who never learned to clean up herself. And I reminded myself, boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity. In the evenings, the city became my companion. I'd walk streets I barely knew, letting neon reflections ripple on wet pavement, past windows glowing with other people's dinners, other people's lives. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to be on the inside, part of family that laughed together without someone like Zoe pulling all the gravity toward herself. But wishing didn't change reality. And slowly I stopped wishing. One Friday, I found a used record shop tucked between a laundromat and a closed bakery. Inside, it smelled like cardboard sleeves, dust, and old hope. I flipped through bins of albums, touching covers that had outlived the people who'd first loved them. Music had always been something private for me. Growing up, I'd listen with headphones while Zoe slammed doors and my parents tried to soothe her storms. Back then, the music wasn't just a hobby. It was shelter. I bought a secondhand record player, scuffed but still working, and carried it home on the bus. That night, I sat on the windowsill, carefully lowered the needle, and let the crackle and warmth fill the small apartment. No applause, no one to share it with, but it was enough, because for the first time, I wasn't performing. I was just being. At work, the team invited me to join a group they called Friday Wins. Everyone shared something small they'd accomplished that week, work-related or not. I hesitated. What did I have to share? But then, I remembered the record player. I set up music in my apartment. I said, my voice a little shaky at first. It's not much, but it makes the place feel more like home. Liam smiled. Sounds like a real win to me, Ethan. And hearing my name said with that quiet respect, that was worth more than any compliment I'd chased growing up. Yet the shadows didn't vanish overnight. Some mornings, I'd wake with my heart pounding, half expecting a message from my parents asking me to fix something Zoe had done. A reflex, so deep it felt like breathing. And every time the phone stayed silent, relief came tangled with something almost like grief, because it meant they weren't thinking about me at all. But little by little, the grief shrank, and the relief grew. One late night, I stood at my window, looking out over the city. The plant on my sill had grown 2 new leaves. In the reflection, I caught my own face, tired but calm, and I whispered quietly to glass, "You're allowed to stay gone." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was something simpler, acceptance, that the people I'd left behind might never change. And I didn't need to keep waiting for them to. I started writing again, not code this time, but words. Short reflections, fragments of thought. Like this one, freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet room where your own heartbeat is the only sound you hear. I didn't know what I'd do with these lines, but it didn't matter. The act of writing them felt like claiming space I'd always given away. On Sunday, I made pasta in my small kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and played an old jazz record. Outside, rain tapped on the fire escape. No one else saw it. No one else needed to. It was enough that I did. Some mornings, it still surprised me how normal life could feel when no one was tearing apart for attention. I'd wake before my alarm, sunlight spilling across the cracked pane on the wall, make coffee in the thrift store mug, feed the pothose plant on my windowsill, now stretching small new leaves toward the light. Routine. Ordinary. But to me, It felt like rebuilding a language I'd forgotten how to speak. At work, weeks turned into a quiet rhythm of pull requests and daily stand-ups. My teammates started tagging me in more complex tickets. Liam sent a message one afternoon. Appreciate the way you clean up legacy code. Makes everyone's life easier. It was a single line, but it landed heavier than it should have. Because growing up, praise always came wrapped in a warning. Don't let it go to your head. Or, why can't you help your sister too? This was just acknowledgement. No strings. No hidden bill to pay later. And it felt like breathing, without realizing you've been holding your breath for years. On Thursday nights, Ben and I started a quiet ritual. We'd video call, each with a drink, and talk about nothing important. New music, half-finished projects, a stupid meme someone sent. Once, Ben asked, "You ever think about going back?" Talking to them. I hesitated, staring at the condensation on my glass. Sometimes, I admitted, but then I remember why I left. "Fair," he said. "Just promise me one thing, man. Don't let them decide your story twice." I nodded, though I don't know if he saw. But the word stayed with me. The loneliness didn't disappear. Some nights, I catch myself instinctively drafting texts to mom or dad. A reflex like muscle memory. Share the good news. Ask for advice. Just reach out. But every time, my thumb hovered over send, and every time I stopped, not because I didn't care, but because I'd finally realized they weren't waiting on the other side of the screen, wondering how I was. And I couldn't keep writing chapters of my life for an audience that wasn't reading. I still check Zoe's Instagram sometimes, half curious, half wary. Her feed had quieted. No more parties, no flashy captions about owning the moment. Just filtered coffee shots and old photos, each one straining to look like a fresh start. Part of me wondered if she missed me. But a bigger part knew Zoe didn't miss people. She missed what people did for her. And maybe that was the hardest lesson of all. At work, we launched a new feature ahead of schedule. Liam called me into a one-on-one. "You made a real difference, Ethan," he said. "The team feels it too." That night, I opened my window, let the city air spill into the room, and said it quietly to the dark. I made a difference. It wasn't loud. No family dinner table, no forced applause. But it felt more real than any praise I'd chased before. One Saturday, I wandered into the same coffee shop I'd visited on my first week here. The barista with the paper crane tattoo smiled when she saw me. "You're becoming a regular," she teased. "Guess I am," I said, almost shyly. She handed me my coffee. "I like your calm vibe," she said. "It's nice. Steady." I'd never thought of myself as steady. Growing up, I was a quiet background to Zoe's storms. Steady by necessity, not choice. But hearing it now, without pity, without expectation, felt like reclaiming something. That evening, back at the apartment, I pulled out an old notebook I hadn't opened since college. Between blank pages were scribbles, half-finished thoughts, fragments of a voice I hadn't listened to in years. One line caught my eye, written so small it was almost hidden in the margin. "When silence stops being a shield, maybe it could become a home." Reading it, I realized silence had once been survival, then it became a prison. And now, finally, it was turning into something gentler, a space where my own voice could live, even if no one else heard it. Sunday brought rain, soft and unhurried, tapping on the fire escape like an old friend. I brewed tea instead of coffee, letting the steam warm my hands. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and jasmine. Looking around, I saw my quiet victories. The potholes plant, stubbornly alive. The record player, now with 3 new albums leaning beside it. A sticky note on the fridge that simply read, "You're allowed to be here." None of it looked impressive. But for me, it was proof. Life didn't have to be loud to be real. That night, a voicemail came from Dad. His voice sounded older, edges frayed. "We miss you, Ethan. Call us back." I listened twice, but the words felt hollow, shaped more by guilt than recognition. Not "how are you?" Not "we're proud of you." Just "come back." As if presence alone could fix what years of silence and blindness had built. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my laptop and wrote. I used to think love meant always showing up, no matter what. Now I know love also means knowing when to stop. And walking away isn't always leaving. Sometimes it's arriving, finally, at yourself. Later, I went for a walk. The city lights reflected in wet pavement. At an intersection, I caught my reflection in a shop window. Not quite the same man who walked out his old apartment months ago. Thinner, maybe. Tired, yes. But also standing taller, unburdened by someone else's storms. Back home, I sat by the window. Plant beside me, record spinning slow jazz into the room. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for staying." Not to anyone else. Just to the part of me that hadn't given up when it would have been so easy to. And for the first time, it felt like enough. Some nights, I still found myself staring at my phone, fingers hovering over the contacts list, caught between the impulse to reach out and the steady voice inside saying, "Not yet." It wasn't that I didn't want connection. Sometimes I craved it deeply. But every time I thought about calling my parents, or even Zoe, I was reminded of how much those calls always ended up being about fixing someone else's mess. Not about me. Never about me. I remember the exact moment I realized I was no longer their silent safety net. It was a Thursday evening just after work. I was scrolling through an old group chat I'd left months ago, the one with family. Zoe had posted a picture. A party. The usual blur of half-smiling faces, raised glasses, and loud music. The caption was dripping with that same self-assured bravado she always wore like armor. "Living my best life. No apologies." Beneath it, my mom had commented, "Proud of you, honey." And there was again her and their world revolving around her chaos, while I hovered somewhere off-screen, invisible as ever. But this time, I didn't reply or react. I didn't send a message asking if they missed me. I didn't argue or defend myself. Instead, I closed the app, set my phone down, and did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a run. The city streets were quiet. The kind of stillness that comes after a rainstorm, when the air smells clean and the world feels like it's been given a fresh start. I ran not because I wanted to escape, but because I wanted to remind myself that I was more than a background character in someone else's story. That I had a voice. That I could set my own pace. By the time I came back, my lungs burning but my mind clearer, I sat at my desk and opened a blank document. I began writing, not for anyone else, not to explain or justify, but to lay down the parts of me I've been carrying silently for so long. I am not the footnote in my family story. I am not the shadow of my sister's spotlight. I am Ethan Ward and I'm here. The words felt heavy but freeing, like setting down a burden and taking a breath I didn't know I was holding. Over the following weeks, that document grew. Fragments of memories, reflections on silence and strength, moments of pain and hope. It became a record of who I was, without their interference, without their expectations. And with every paragraph, I felt myself reclaiming space I'd been denied. At work, things were shifting too. The team had begun trusting me with leadership on a small project, a back-end system overhaul that, if done right, would improve user experience across the app. Liam told me, "You're not just fixing problems anymore, you're creating solutions." Those words felt like validation, an echo of the confidence I'd never been allowed to hold on to growing up. I started waking up excited instead of anxious. Coding didn't feel like a task imposed by survival. It was becoming something I loved. But as I rebuilt my life, shadows of the past still crept in. One evening, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. "Can we please talk? Zoe's been struggling and we need you." For a moment, my heart skipped. The old ache resurfaced, the urge to fix, to rescue. But I remembered all the times I'd lost myself doing just that, how my own life had been derailed while I tried to hold their chaos together. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message. That night, I sat by the window, city lights flickering below like distant stars. I whispered myself, "You cannot pour from an empty cup." It was a phrase I'd heard 1,000 times, but only now did it settle deep inside me. I wasn't a failure for setting boundaries. I was survival. I started to see my silence differently, not as weakness, but as armor sharpened with purpose. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to be deliberate. And so I was. One Saturday, Ben came over with a six-pack of beer and a deck of cards. We played late into the night, laughing, joking, just two guys untangling the weight of their lives one hand at a time. "Look at you, man," Ben said, shaking his head. "From invisible to indispensable." I smiled. Maybe it wasn't about how loud you were, but how steady you stayed. Yet, the toughest moment was still ahead. A family dinner was scheduled, an event I'd avoided for months. I knew it wasn't about reconciliation. It was a reckoning. When I walked into that room, the air thick with forced smiles and hushed conversations, I saw the empty chair waiting for me, one that felt less like an invitation and more like a challenge. And this time I was ready. I didn't just sit. I spoke. I told them everything they'd missed. How I'd been gone for weeks without anyone noticing. How Zoe had taken over my home, my things, my life. How I had to fight. Not just to protect my property, but to reclaim myself. The room fell silent. The laughter stopped. And I saw in their eyes the shock of realizing I wasn't the quiet, compliant brother anymore. I laid out the evidence. Photos, videos, messages. I told them about the eviction, the police report, the insurance claim. And when I was done, I said, "I didn't leave to punish you. I left to save myself." No one knew what to say. Zoe's smile had vanished, replaced with something fragile and unfamiliar. Regret, maybe. My parents looked at me as if seeing a stranger, and I felt something strange. Power, not the kind that comes from anger, but the quiet strength of owning your truth. I left that night with my head held high. I didn't wait for apologies or explanations. I had already found what I'd been searching for all along: peace. Now, as I sit here, telling you my story, I want you to remember this. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the sharpest blade. Sometimes it's the loudest roar. And sometimes it's simply the space where you learn to live for yourself, finally, truly, and without apology. The night before that family dinner, I barely slept. Not because of anxiety. No, I'd face worse. But because of quiet storm inside me. A whirlwind of old wounds and new resolve twisting into something I hadn't felt before. Clarity. I sat on my apartment floor, surrounded by scattered papers, printed photos, screenshots of texts, videos saved in my phone. Each one a testament to the chaos Zoe had spun around my life. I looked at them all and realized something crucial. I wasn't the victim. I was the author. For years, I'd let others write my story, filling the pages with their expectations, their dramas, their neglect. But now, the pen was mine. Walking into that dining room felt like stepping onto a stage set for a reckoning. The air was thick with forced smiles, polite greetings that didn't reach the eyes. They all expected the silent Ethan, the quiet son, the steady brother who took the blame and never fought back. But that version of me had been buried under 6 weeks of absence, under the weight of betrayal and self-preservation. Tonight, that version would die. I sat down, the chair creaking under me, the center of attention I'd never wanted but now embraced. The roast chicken sat half-eaten, the wine glasses stained with forgotten toasts. They talked, but I barely heard them. I was counting the moments before I spoke. When the right moment came, I leaned forward, voice steady and clear. I haven't lived here for 6 weeks. The room froze. The laughter died mid-smile. Forks dropped. Eyes widened. No one had noticed. Not a single one of them. That silence was more deafening than any argument. I let it stretch, filling the space with the weight of every time they'd brushed me aside. Every conversation I'd been excluded from. Every time Zoe's mistakes were forgiven, while I was told to be the bigger person. They stared, unable to hide the shock, the guilt, the disbelief. I told them everything. The parties, the stolen moments, the items sold without permission, the forged signatures, the eviction notice, the police report. I laid out the facts calmly, deliberately, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Because that's what I was. No longer the silent brother, but the one demanding justice for himself. My mother's eyes welled with tears. My father's face flushed with anger. Zoe sat silent, her bravado stripped away, replaced by a fragile vulnerability I'd never seen before. But I didn't back down. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity. When I finished, I stood up, the room still heavy with unspoken words. I looked at each of them in turn. This family only notices me when they need something. That line hit harder than I expected, even for me, but it was true. I walked toward the door, feeling lighter with every step. Behind me, the silence hung like smoke after a fire. Thick, suffocating, but undeniable. 2 days later, Zoe was gone. Evicted. Cut off from the life she'd taken for granted. The landlord didn't care about tears or excuses. He had the evidence, and that was enough. She lost her job. Her social media faded into shadows, and her carefully curated image cracked under the weight of reality. My parents called, repeatedly, begging, accusing, pleading for peace. But I had learned something invaluable. Peace wasn't about them. It was about me. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, created distance not out of anger, but necessity. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt not just my apartment, but my life. I found new friends who showed up without drama, without conditions. I started volunteering, teaching coding to kids who, like me, needed a chance to be seen. The quiet that once felt like a prison had become a sanctuary. One evening, I sat on my balcony, city lights twinkling below. I raised a glass of wine, toasted to no one and everyone, to the silent battles fought and won, to the strength found in solitude. And I whispered to the night, I am enough. Because now I knew silence isn't weakness. It's the space where you find your voice, where you write your own story. And mine? It's just beginning. There's a strange kind of peace that comes after a long war. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, steady calm of knowing you fought for yourself and finally won. That peace is what I found after I closed the door behind me on that family dinner. After I left the echoes of silence and neglect behind. In the weeks and months that followed, my life unfolded in ways I never dared imagine. The apartment I returned to was mine again, filled not with chaos, but with intention. A space I built, piece by piece, with the kind of care I'd never received but always knew I deserved. I bought a new desk, one that fit my height perfectly. I hung photos of friends and moments that mattered. Not staged smiles for an audience, but genuine laughter caught in between breaths. There was no more room for shadows from past. Only light filtered through sheer curtains that I chose myself. Work became more than a paycheck. It was a craft, a place where my voice mattered. Leading projects, mentoring new coders, sharing the knowledge I fought so hard to gain. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. The people around me reflected the person I'd become. Friends who celebrated without conditions. Conversations that didn't revolve around drama or blame. A community built on respect, trust, and quiet understanding. I even started dating again. Something I'd avoided for years, afraid to bring anyone into the mess that was my family life. But now, with my boundaries clear and my heart guarded yet open, I found someone who saw me for who I was. Not the background figure in a family saga, but a man with depth, kindness, and strength. Still, the past wasn't something I erased. It was a chapter that shaped me but no longer defined me. I chose to forgive, not to absolve them of their mistakes, but to free myself from the chains of resentment. Forgiveness became my gift to myself, a way to heal the scars without reopening them. The silence that once felt like an absence now spoke louder than words. It told stories of resilience, of quiet battles fought behind closed doors, of a man who learned that sometimes the loudest roar is the one you don't have to make. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that empty chair at the dinner table, the one that had been waiting for me but was never truly meant for me. I realize now that chair wasn't a place to belong, but a reminder of what I was escaping. I'm grateful for the silence because it gave me the space to hear myself. And so this is my story. Not just a tale of pain and betrayal, but one of growth, courage, and rebirth. A reminder that you don't have to be loud to be heard. That standing up for yourself can be done with quiet dignity. And that sometimes the greatest victories come from walking away, not with anger, but with grace. If you're listening to this, If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or unheard, know this. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to stop waiting for others to see you and start seeing yourself. Because at the end of the day, the only approval you truly need is your own. And I finally have it. The silence is mine now, and in it I am free.